Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Don Amerson. I'm a teacher here at Orange County School of the Arts, and I've worked in theater for social justice for the past 15 years. I'm really proud that OSHA has its first theater for social justice class this year that's taught during the elective day and also as part of the acting conservatory. I also teach in musical theater, and I'm the real proud um, troupe director of our Theater Honor Society Thespians. So thank you all for being here. Today's event is part of our 5th annual Master Artist Series. This series brings acclaimed artists and industry professionals to OSHA to work with our talented students, building their skills and providing inspiration and guidance for their futures. This year, we have an impressive list of visiting guest artists, including Academy Award-winning screenwriter and director Kevin Wilmot, trailblazing ballerina Misty Copeland, Academy Award-winning costume designer Ruth E. Carter, and one of today's guest panelists, Anna Deveare Smith. So we're deeply grateful to our sponsors, including Ken, Penny, and Jack Robertson, who have helped make today's experience possible. These are 3 of the most empathetic, caring people that I know. So I was so happy to hear that they were able to help us out. It's due to their generous support that we're able to provide our students with unparalleled opportunities in the arts like these. We'd also like to express our gratitude for our special OSHA supporters that are joining us here today. Uh, we are glad to have you all with us, and we appreciate your continued dedication to our school. All right, so get ready, because today we've got this writers discussion panel. It's going to be kind of casual, but I want to just tell you that these folks are all using their art to illuminate issues, in particular issues around social change, racial inclusivity, and cultural competency. We are honored to be joined by these 3 esteemed panelists to participate in today's discussion. We have Tony Award and Pulitzer Prize nominated playwright, actress, teacher, and author Anna Deveare Smith, acclaimed author of Not Light But Fire, How to Lead Meaningful Race Discussions, Meaningful Race Conversations in the Classroom, Matthew R. Kay, and celebrated writer, activist, founder of the Native Storytelling Project, and OSHA's very own recent 2020 alumni of the Acting Conservatory, Isabella Madrigal. Now, we're excited to have all these artists, and they're all coming from different angles in the way that they write and the actual art that they make. So that's going to be exciting. I think sometimes we get on these writer panels, and every writer is a novelist, or every writer is a nonfiction writer. So we've got people from different genres. In addition, we will have, at the end of this session at 4 o'clock, we're going to have a meet and greet with the OSHA and the SGV BSU groups. They're going to be meeting with Matthew R.K. at 4 o'clock. So if you're in one of those groups, stick around. Our discussion today will cover all the writers, their influences, their process, and lots of your questions. I have most of the questions that we have today are from students that wanted to sort of remain anonymous, but they wanted their questions out there. So I'll be diving into that pool of questions. So we're really excited, and we hope that you enjoy. Everyone, please welcome Isabella Madrigal, Matthew R.K., and Miss Anna Deveare Smith. Let's get started with some opening comments. Maybe we can have Isabella say hello and tell us anything that you want to start.
Yeah, so hi everyone. It's good to be back, I guess even virtually at OSHA. Like Donald said, like Mr. Amerson said, I am the kind of co-founder of the Native Storytelling Project in partnership with my younger sister, who's actually a student at OCSA right now in the Acting Conservatory, Sophia. So kind of just a little bit about kind of the work that I do for those of you who are unfamiliar. The project is about kind of reframing the narrative surrounding the Indigenous experience, and it produced the original play Menil and Her Heart, which was really about, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and about centering community performance. So I did graduate from OCSA last year, and right now I'm actually zooming in from Boston. I'm attending Harvard for this semester, and then going to be leaving actually next Sunday. So.
Mr. Kay.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me. My name is Matt Kay. I'm a school teacher in Philadelphia. I wrote Not Light But Fire a couple years ago, and I'm just happy to see all of you.
All right, and Ms. Smith?
Boy, everybody's brief. And I'm Anna Deavere Smith. I'm an actor and a writer, and I taught Professor Stephanie Dorian when she was 6. Because she's a prodigy, and I currently teach at New York University in New York.
Those lucky New York University students, I tell you. So let's go ahead and get started with some questions. And we had a lot of questions about what influences you. What are the influences on your work? I know, Isabella, you briefly talked about some of the influences on your work. Do you want to expand upon that? And then if the other panelists would like to chime in.
Yeah, definitely. I think, for me and specifically kind of the big project that I've been working on for the last year, almost now, Menil and Her Heart, it was kind of, I guess, born out of the lack of Native representation in the arts. But it kind of goes beyond that because it was also about, our defining stories kind of being missing from the national narrative, kind of as a very purposeful kind of erasure. And so, for me, what really, I guess, influences the work that I do that I'm really passionate about is kind of, what does it say? And I think, theater and social justice, they go hand in hand in so many ways. And especially kind of centering community performance is something that I'm really interested in. Kind of when we did the play, it's a cast of about 18, mostly entirely non-actors, people who had never been involved in theater before. And so to kind of do it in that way, I think was kind of part of the beauty of it, right? Because it was people who had lived these experiences sharing these stories. And so it is kind of about, for me, decolonizing theater, changing, what it means to be worthy, and kind of the standards by which we look and we judge art. And so, I kind of think there's so much freedom and room in that, and that's really exciting to me. But yeah, I definitely get a lot of influence from community, social justice issues, and that's been something that's kind of been crazy for me to kind of think about how political theater can be. When I first kind of wrote the play and got it out there, it was more about cultural revitalization to me, about community coming together to do something. And so it was just really shocking to see kind of where that can take you and how I think theater is one of kind of the strongest mediums, art, for social justice, to say something about the world we live in. And it's taken me a lot of different places to a lot of different realms that I didn't, I hadn't thought of theater touching before, but it's been a very, very incredible experience in that way.
I love this term that you use, decolonizing theater and making it accessible for all. That's really the goal of Theater for Social Justice, is to bring more people in as spectators, but also as participants in theater. So I love that. Mr. Kay, do you want to say anything about what influences your writing?
I do a lot of different kinds of writing, but as far as my book is concerned, I had one overarching influence, and that's my students. I really love leading race conversations in the classroom. I think it's important. And one of my biggest frustrations, to be honest, was that as I tried to get better at it, most of the resources that I found out there were more geared towards convincing teachers to have race conversations and not enough about how to do it the right way. And I found that a little frustrating because I find that like base level, that's step one, and I'm on like step 2 or 3 or 4. And everything's about trying to convince folks, hey, it's important. Hey, all kids can learn. Hey, it's important to engage race. And there wasn't as much out there for folks who already understand it and are ready for like, okay, but how do I do it right? How do I make it the most useful experience for my students? How do I, just how am I the most productive version of myself? And I figured that I would write something that was going to be nowhere near perfect, but at least wasn't attempted. Like I wanted to like not. I just feel like folks who need to be convinced to talk about race suck up too much of our energy. Like we're always focusing on them, and I wanted to focus on folks like me, whose kind of brains and hearts are in the right place, but they kind of like, all right, so what's next? And I wanted to be on that. I wanted to contribute to that kind of energy, and so that's my biggest driving influence because that's what my kids need. Like my kids need level 2. And I can't get stuck where everybody else is. So that's where I tried to be.
Now, what about your poetry? Because I know that you run that group of poets. What about your poetry?
Some of y'all may have heard of the Brave New Voices Festival, the international slam poetry competition that happens every year. The short version of it is I have a interesting relationship with slam poetry because you probably can even hear in my voice that I'm a stutterer. And so when I was really young, like it was really hard for me to speak in front of people. And then when I was in college, I discovered slam, and it was something that like just blew my mind. And for some reason, because of the breathing, because of all those sorts of things, it just helped me a lot. And so I figured when I became a teacher, it's like, how cool would it be if all of a sudden there was, how schools have athletic teams, and I'm a basketball coach, so I know that. But what if schools had slam poetry teams too? And so in Philly, we started about 10 years ago now with about 5 or 6 schools. And now we average around 20 a year. And so we meet every Friday. We have poetry slams. We have a champion. We use the Kimmel Center. And like, we just have these awesome moments for kids so that they can just kind of develop like I did. So they get the chance to experience what I experienced, but like more systemically. Like I like happened into it in college, but I love seeing it with like 13-year-olds and 14-year-olds who can learn it. I learned it when I was 19, but these kids are learning it when they're 13. And I think that makes a big difference.
Wow. They are very fortunate to have that start. And because we all learn in so many different ways, and we all access the arts in so many different ways. I'm so glad that's available to them. Ms. Smith, what about your influences? We know your characters.
I'll be influenced by today, by Isabella and Mr. Kay. We're in a moment of a paradigm shift, I think. At the very least, we know that the COVID pandemic has placed us in a moment of a great unknown. And when it first hit, and I met with my graduate students from the 2 years before. When it hit, I wasn't teaching. I only teach 1 semester a year. And the ones were supposed to have graduated in June, were very upset. And to me, I said, look, you guys just go out and change it. The thing is falling apart, at least briefly, it's falling apart. So that means you have nothing to lose. And a lot of people get out of school and they don't have a job anyway. So I'm waiting in a way to see what this new paradigm shift is going to be if the murder of George Floyd and the other horrible, tragic murders that we saw with our own eyes. People say that it's an unprecedented moment. I don't know that I agree with that. I mean, you have to look at history. Just think about how Africa was completely colonized until the 20th century, the sort of mid 20th century and late 20th century. So we have seen rebellions, we've seen transformations in the past, certainly in many different ways. But nonetheless, this is a moment. We call it a moment of reckoning. When you see the results of this election, I'm not so sure who's reckoning with what. But at any rate, let me say that it's the world outside of me is changing, and so partially I'm open to the influence of people like Isabella and Mr. K, and certainly the extraordinary writers who and performers that I saw yesterday, who are all, without a doubt, there's just no question about it, they're all uh, 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 concerned with identity, as one of them said, used this word, I think, predetermined. Ella used that word, and so this notion that is there anything predetermined? So I'm influenced by the time now, this time.
Yeah. And in our classes, we've had to meet that challenge of, can we do something that we've never done before? Can we innovate? Can we use this moment and make the best lemonade that you can taste in the world? And in some of my classes, I think we've been able to go into certain subjects in a way that I don't think we ever would have had we been in class the entire time. So I think we've certainly made the most of it. So, Ms. Smith, I have a question for you. We all know the characters that you embody, and we've had a chance to look at a lot of your work. In our society, we have experienced appreciation, and we've also experienced appropriation or misappropriation. When an artist is devising this ethnographic work, how can they tell if they've crossed that line from appreciation over to appropriation?
Well, I think that's different for every artist, and I don't think it should be prescribed. I don't think that art is protocol, and by that I mean, there will be people who do things that I don't think are quote unquote appropriate according to my register. But I don't think that that should be predetermined, and that people will have to learn how far to go or not to go. And I think that professor, am I right? The young man, West, is that his name? The first one to perform?
Yes, West.
So
Yes.
West, I feel, is the type of person who could help us by pushing the envelope, because he looks like something that he is not entirely. And a lot of this idea of what's appropriate or not appropriate has to do with what we appear to be, our born now, we're questioning born gender. And then we have our born race. And I think that the only way to get at it is people like West, who actually authentically can throw a wild card. That's what I would say. But I would never prescribe this for anyone. I would be the first to say I'm offended and even write a review, maybe pick it. But that's that artist on that journey. And I think schools should allow people to go on their real journey. And if they mess it up, they make a big mess. But that's the only way you're going to build the muscles that you need to have the moral core, which is your moral core.
I love that response. Mr. K or Ms. Madrigal, do you want to chime in on that? You don't have to. It's okay. I just want to give space to that. Isabella, I'm gonna. What's that?
You shouldn't have started with me on that.
No, I wanted to start. I wanted to go there right away. So I'm glad that we did. Isabella, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
You were a student here at school, and your sister's a student, like you said, here. Obviously, the summer has fueled a lot of change. What do you wish, regarding social justice, what do you wish that we had when you were here? What would have helped you? And the follow-up to that is, do you think that we have made any changes starting this semester?
Yeah, so I think that, like I said, I have a younger sister who she's still going through the acting conservatory right now. So I do hear some things from her. And, I think that like Miss Smith said, it's a time of reckoning. And I think, with that comes a lot of work to do. And kind of, I think kind of reclaiming storytelling and continuing storytelling is so powerful, especially for young people. And I think, that's huge in identity and thinking of what inspired me to write Menil and Her Heart, right? Representation, but I think it was also the fact that I didn't see those stories that mattered to me being shown. And I think that kind of comes down to a lot of who we highlight as worthy artists, kind of a little bit like I said earlier. A lot of the time, those works that we study, who we study, with very few exceptions, are kind of mostly the works of, white men, because that's kind of what good theater is defined as. And so, that's the theater history we learn a lot of the time, and that's kind of what we're introduced to, and that's kind of the standard that's set. And that's everywhere. And so I think, really that's only kind of a snippet of this really broad realm of studying of what is storytelling. And so, that was kind of a big inspiration for me to kind of create my own work and kind of create the stories that I wanted to see. But I hear about the Theater for Social Justice class, and I think that's something that I would have loved, had it been there at my time. And I remember kind of hearing a little bit about it kind of when I was a senior and hearing some of that, which is really neat. But I think that's definitely, so important to kind of to highlight that. And so I think, we need more kind of BIPOC representation in the works that we read, and also in the people who are performing them. I think that's also important. Yeah, I'm excited to see what happens, and I think there are some really, really good changes being made, and I think that comes with the willingness to be different and to kind of understand that things are a little more complex than we think all the time.
Yeah, I love the fact that you took what wasn't there and you made it happen, right? It's something that I encourage my students to do all the time. I often get comments that there are no good roles for women. Well, guess what? You're going to have to write them. You're a performer, but you're going to have to actually write them.
Yeah, I remember you telling me that in sophomore year. Yes.
Yeah, it's not fair that as an actor we have to write parts for ourselves, but that's just the reality, is that we have to become creators and devisers. Mr. Kay, I wanted to take a question from you, or give a question to you. In your book, Not Light But Fire, you refer to this internal monologue. Now, when I was reading that, I could really relate to the internal monologue. You mentioned professional development in which the staff was watching a piece from Jon Stewart's Daily Show entitled Race Off. At the end, you said that you were impatient with his light and your fire, and it made you want to just leave the room. What can you tell our students about the importance of sort of like controlling that internal monologue?
Well, I'm not sure how much it's about controlling as much as it is like being mindful of kind of what you give the keys. Like, if that makes any sense. Like I remember in that meeting, if I remember the part you're referencing correctly, I was really frustrated. It was right after, I forgot which particular police killing that was, but I remember sitting in this thing and I'm thinking like that Jon Stewart's whole thing just made me feel icky. Like I was in a space where it's kind of like his overarching thesis was like how like really hard it is to be Black. And I'm sitting there in this room full of all these white people. I'm going like, well, thanks, genius. I knew that. It was in one of the spaces where I was like feeling super snarky. I was feeling super hurt. I was feeling super right. And I was in a space where like, I needed, and it really helps me to try to, I'll never pretend to know exactly what my students feel, right? But I felt like I had a taste of it, right? So like when a teacher gets up and they are, teacher might be trying their best, as I'm sure he was with their routine and everything. And yet it's not helping. And yet the students feel icky. And yet the overarching feeling upon leaving you further narratives about weakness and victimhood and all of these things, and you haven't helped. you
Yeah.
may have helped yourself. You may have dealt with your own guilt. You may have dealt with your own, but it wasn't kid-centered and it wasn't particularly useful to them. And so that narrative that was going on in my head, trying to make sure that I gave it the keys, not to make me lash out at my colleagues for planning an activity, not to make me, but to actually say, oh, this is how I feel. How can I put use to that and like gear it towards empathy so I can be a better teacher for my students? You know what I mean? It could just make me more frustrated. It could just make me more cynical. It could just make me, into that kind of person that no one wants to talk to because they're always just at everybody, right? Or I could say, man, this stinks. Like these are some allies who are trying to help me out, who are trying to lead this thoughtful professional development about race, and it is a strikeout, right? How can I make sure that when I step to the plate, I make contact? Like, I know how I feel now. And so how can I make sure that when I get in front of my 16-year-olds, my 15-year-olds, they don't leave my race conversation feeling worse. And so just making sure that you don't give your like frustration the keys to the point where it kind of takes you off the cliff. You know what I mean? Like make sure you point it in the more productive direction.
And I don't know if it's this way for you, but for me, sometimes the well-intended, there's a special frustration that happens when you're dealing with well-intended folks.
Yeah.
That want to help, they think they're helping, but it's light, it's not fire. It's not enough.
Well, it's important to also remember like that there are, to really embrace complexity and really get comfortable with complexity, because like there are if 2020, I agree with what was said about like this isn't new stuff, right? This isn't new stuff that's happening in this country. Like this country has a racist history that we are seeing like very much a lot. And yet one thing that, our recent history is making super clear is that there are like people who frustrate us. There are people who disappoint us. And there's that category, right? And then there's flat out enemies. And 2020 and the last few years, last 4 years has like made it super clear. There are also flat out enemies like it's not about they've disappointed you. It's not about you expect more. It's not about, it's not the way that allies can frustrate you. Right? It's the way that this person would not care if you live or die. This person would not. And I think if anything, these recent years have reintroduced us to the concept of flat out enemies that my grandparents would have known very well and that my parents know very well. And we had kind of convinced ourselves that the biggest enemies are the folks who just kind of annoy us or frustrate us or disappoint us. But that's, so I think I'm not going to go home pissed off at my colleagues for trying something that doesn't necessarily work when there are enemies out there who are trying to disenfranchise my children. There's a difference.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. So we had a lot of questions about using art, using our writing to unite community. So whether that be the micro community of your school or your classroom or the larger community of your state, your country, the world. So this is a really broad question, but how can we use this art to unite community? And I'll take that from any of the panelists that want to chime in.
Well, I have to say that in this moment, we can't expect that everybody is into that. Thinking about what Mr. Kay said about flat out enemies, and it makes me think of Araya's material yesterday and Professor Dorian asking her to tell us about what happened in a restaurant with her mother. Mm-hmm. And, we get reminded of those enemies sometimes. And I don't know that it's for everybody to be the uniter. especially in the world of art. And especially in this moment, I think what's real is that we will actually see more fractures. And, you know, if you think about when I think about my play, Twilight, Los Angeles, which is about the Los Angeles riots in the 90s. And I went there and I felt, yeah, I mean, the city had exploded. And for the work I do, I'm a dramatist, so catastrophe is the food of my work. And to me, what that riot, which we don't like, you know, I'm not calling for revolution or unrest necessarily, or people getting their businesses burned down, or anything like that. But it did occur to me that when things fall apart, when things break open, you do have a chance to look at things differently. And sometimes the process of trying to make sense of it and bring it back together again really restores dignity for all involved. So I don't think that it's necessarily the right prescription to expect unitedness. Some people have that aptitude and others do not. Yesterday I called, I tend to be more towards that, right? I called yesterday for people to come out of what I call safe houses of identity, which is very dangerous because if you go out of your house, you cannot go back in necessarily. And the other people on the other side are certainly not going to let you in. So you have to be in what I call the Crossroads of Ambiguity. And I've been calling for that since the 90s. And I know that's not popular. But I really understand that it's only a few people who will do that, who can do that, who are interested in doing that. So who am I to say that if you feel that you have to attend to something that's outside of the predetermined structure, that you shouldn't do that? And I think right now, where art is not at the place of uniting, I think some people from an outside position will be able to influence what will eventually be aptitude towards uniting, a wish towards that. And somebody in some realm will make a love song or make a ballet that will bring people together, but it's not obvious. So I'll end by saying something about the Alumna American Dance Theater, which has the biggest building for dance in the United States of America, Black company, predominantly Black company. It was started by a Black man named Alvin Ailey, who made a ballet in the late 50s called Revelations, which was about the Black experience. I don't think he was trying to necessarily unite, I don't know, but that ballet started with 6 stools and some dancers and going around in a station wagon and performing at the Y. Revelations has been endowed to be performed forever. Eventually, Revelations spoke to a worldwide audience of people of all colors. And if you ever want to have a real party of your soul, go to Germany or Asia. And I saw in Germany how the Germans behaved when they saw Revelations. Or in Austria, I saw how the Austrians of all people, behaved when Jesse Norman sang Amazing Grace. So I think that we can't just go for uniting. We have to go for something that's going to reach. And then we'll see how politics and education and everything else goes with that heartfelt expression to help us towards uniting. But it could also go towards revolution in reality.
So it sounds like we just got to create, and whatever's in your
Well,
heart.
I don't know. I mean, maybe not in a school, maybe not. Maybe you want to have more directives. But I'm just talking about what I think reality is, in my experience.
All right. Well, we've got a lot of questions about the process, the writing process, and how you create. So I wanted to switch gears and start talking about the process itself. one of the things that we covered, or we talked about a lot with our students is the idea of taking that thought and putting it on the page. How do you get it from it's this nebulous thing, and now it's actually a text that maybe is going to get published, maybe it's not going to get published, but it goes from that nebulous thing to being text. Can you all walk us through your process in general, or in as much detail as you like, about how do you get it from thoughts in your head to something that's on the paper? And Isabella, would you like to start?
Yeah. So I think for me, and I think my writing process, or if that's what you call it, has changed definitely a lot. Just even in the past few months, in terms of how I think about creating and story. And I think a lot of that for me is I feel like I get an idea and then I just want to get it down, as fast as I can. And I feel like I work kind of in short and intense bursts. And it's kind of, sometimes it's just kind of an inkling of, a character or a situation. One piece of advice that I got that I thought was, it's a bit helpful. Kind of just, as you're going through life and experiencing things, if something like particularly strikes you, to just write it down then, and just kind of keep maybe some of those things that you notice. And that's the kind of a practice that I've very recently adopted to see if it works. But I'll get these little things, like usually right before I go to bed, or if I'm out about my day and I see something, and just writing those down and then leaving them and then coming back to them, like, I don't know, a week or two later, months later even, and remembering that. I think that can help a lot too with writer's block, if you're trying to create something new, as well, because it's something fresh, it's something real. Something about that moment was just so striking that I wrote it down 3 months ago, and I want to see what it means now. But also kind of learning for me the importance of editing, I think too. The play I wrote a year and a half ago now, it's drastically different than the first time we performed it. And I think that's great, and it's changed so much, but I think hopefully for the better. And so kind of patience and sitting with these things, and creating things you love so that you don't mind, like a year later, going back and working it again and discovering new things, is so important too. So yeah, I don't know if I have a very specific process, but these are just little practices that I'm collecting, and hopefully, I'll figure something out.
We had another question about you, Isabella, about the being young, being a playwright at such a young age. Do you think that your youth influences your writing in any kind of way that's different, that you have a different process, or that it makes a difference? I personally don't think it does. I just tell people writers are writers. But what's your take on being a young writer versus a more seasoned writer?
Yeah, I think I kind of agree with you, and that I don't know if there's such a huge difference. I mean, definitely in terms of experience, I think you just get better as you do more, and a lot of writing and a lot of art is just about doing it, for the first time, and learning from that. And I think, just in terms of personal change and growth, I think a lot of it has just come from doing it. I think I've grown more in like the last few months as a writer than maybe in like my entire life up to that point, just because I was doing it at that time and I was so invested in it. And so, I don't think that if you think you're too young to write something, or you're too young to lead a project, that should be something that stops you. Because I think also something that I've been thinking about, and something that I was told, is that I think sometimes as a young person, you can kind of underestimate the power of your voice. And particularly when I was speaking, kind of, it was for the International Day of the Girl, last October. And you know, I think, you know, what they highlighted there was, you know, as a young girl, you don't realize the power you have in your voice because there's something so unique about that perspective. And it's something that's only there for a little moment before, you know, you transition on to the next part of your life. But I think realizing the power in that, and that that's something people want to hear because that's not a story that's told all that often. So I think that's what I would say too to that.
Very good. And Mr. K, walk us through your process of taking the ideas from your head and putting them on a page.
I, you know, to be honest, I'm not sure how much of what I do would fall into the term process. I think if there's anything systemic about it, it would be I just collect as much as I can. Like on my desktop right now, I have a folder with hundreds of PDFs of just like articles I thought were interesting, and it's just called like stuff. It's just like articles I thought were interesting that so and so wrote, or little video clips or little stuff that it just intrigued me. And I know, you know, at the end of each of my chapters, like, put this in your pocket. It's one of those moments where they're all just in my pocket, and we're like, at some point it'll be useful. And so I think it's the same kind of thing. You know, it helped me with my writing so much and helped me with my teaching. A lot of times, you know, folks would compliment me and says, how did you find all these outside resources? How did you have this clip to show the kids to do this? How to all this stuff I mentioned? And I wish it was because of some sort of genius, but actually it's just kind of like the folder inside that folder that says race. I scrolled, I said, didn't I see something about? And I just had so much because I'm just walking through life collecting. And so I think collecting before you know what you're going to do with it would be the one systemic thing that I tell my students, and I would tell students here, just collect before you know. Like, you don't have to have a plan for what you're going to do with something when you collect it. I think that's, you know, other than that, it's, I sit down and I just get after it, especially when I'm on a deadline. But I think that's the biggest piece of advice I would give, just to have a repository where you just keep interesting things, like all interesting things. And then as you get enough interesting things, subdivided into folders of interesting things. But after a while, you'd be surprised, one, how much of that stuff you remember. Like, you wouldn't think you would remember it, but you'll get a little whisper, like, I thought I read a memoir that had someone said a scene. And what happens is, I know there are more than a few metaphors. By the way, I only know this in such detail because my audiobook just came out. So I was listening to it, which, by the way, is freaky because it's not my voice. So I'm like hearing these stories and it's like, that's not me, which is weird. And also but there are a few metaphors that popped out there, and I remembered it. It was like something about flying a plane without your instruments or something. And that's just a random Ken Follett fiction story that was there. I'm like, oh, I like that. And I wrote it down. And I just grabbed, so just collect. That's the one thing I would tell kids. Like, you don't have to have a plan for it, but you'll be happy that you grabbed it.
Yeah, I love this idea of collecting because it certainly can sort of give you fodder for something that you're going to write. But I also think about it this way too. If there's ever something that you wanted to do and you needed that support, that information that's out there already, I mean, having that already accessible sort of in folders, that's such a good tip. Such a good tip.
And these get more searchable as things. Like, when I started, it wasn't. It was, but now the way your computer catalogs everything, you can type. Like, I imagine in a couple of years you'll be able to just search it, like search all of your stuff and find.
Yeah.
Isn't there something about an airplane? You type plane and all of a sudden your stuff pops up. That's one of those beautiful things, but you have to do the work of literally just save as PDF, drag into folder, like save as like. But once you do that, it's been a wonderful resource for me, both as a teacher and as a writer. Just the idea of just collecting without a plan, just because I thought it was interesting or cool, and just grabbing it.
Yeah, I love that. I love that tip. Ms. Smith, how do you take it from thoughts in your head to words on a page?
Well, I want to respond to something Mr. K just said, because it makes me think that the collecting is, in a way, I think it's becomes a lifestyle for uh, many artists. When you were talking, there's something called Leon wrote.
Oh,
No. It's a master class that's going on that BSU is part, the coalition's presenting. So I have to be there. This is Anna Deavere Smith. And
okay.
Matt Kay.
Can we mute Leon really quick?
Do you want me to find your kids?
Mr.
Don, you should be able to. Oh, yeah.
We just
Do I have the power to mute? All right, he's muted now. So, all right.
I mean,
sorry about that.
As Mr. K was talking, it occurred to me that this is really a lifestyle in a way. I thought immediately of the character Trigorin in Chekhov's The Seagull, who walks around with a little notebook. It's like a little leitmotif throughout the whole play. Girl, and he puts it away, and I think for all of us, and certainly for actors and poets, that collecting should be information, but also sensory collection. And I'm sure in beginning acting classes, you do a lot of sensory exercises, sense memory and so forth. And what you're asking young developing actors to do is even go back and remember the things that happened to them in their past and sensations. And so I think that we are collecting vehicles that go in the world and collect, or even, I can remember when I was in conservatory, if something terrible happened, I would say, well, that's good for my acting. Heartbreak, that's really good. Rejection, that's really good. Loss, that's really good. Death, rushing to my grandmother and my grandfather's funeral, yes, to honor their life, but also because, I was in that outrageous idea of collect. I was going to collect something from the funeral. So I think that, it's what Mr. K is talking about is also in the 360 world around us, that we are like magnets for the stuff that's in our pores that we never know. Especially, it's certainly with writing, but also with acting, you never know when you're in a moment in rehearsal and you have a memory or you have a feeling, and it helps you understand better the circumstances and also the humanity of the person you're trying to bring breath to. I think that's right. We are, aren't we? We are constantly collecting, and maybe if you face the blank page, one thing to do is, which we all do, is to, sit and remember until something happens.
So would that be also sort of a cure for writer's block as well? It's just to sit, try to remember, and
I don't think I would go that far. I think writer's block is a condition of some kind. I don't even like to really talk about it, because it's kind of like talking to an actor about what do you do about if you forget your lines. I just don't even like to go there, because I do think it is it's just not a very good place to be.
No, it is not. No, it's not.
I want to go back to something you said earlier,
Sure.
Professor Emerson, which is that, this idea of no good roles for women. And I think part of our problem is that we look for these roles in obvious places. And when you say, me hearing now in 2020, the idea of no good roles for women, in a way is heartbreaking, because I'm old enough to have gone through a trillion women's writers' workshops in the 70s and 80s in particular. And just because those plays didn't make it to Broadway, or just because they aren't on Netflix, didn't make it to be a screenplay, doesn't mean that those plays don't exist. And they may not have been published, but I think it's a great service to scour these theaters that funded those plays and dig up those writers, because there were enormous number of wonderful plays written in that time to specifically take care of the problem of, we're limited to, Williams and Williams and Miller, which was the case when I was in conservatory in the 70s. But there are wonderful roles and wonderful plays out there that just never saw the light of day, for the same reason that a lot of excellent material won't see the light of day today. But we hope it'll be better given the moment of reckoning.
Yeah, and in my class in particular, I did the extra search for more material to cover more affinity groups, if you will. So I think when I taught the class, we got into a little bit more than what you would get in your typical like theater history class or play reading class. So I think we found more materials than what was obvious.
In a way, it's an act of rebellion to go back and look. The plays I found when I was asked to direct, in conservatory, because what were they going? My year there were no other Black people, but by the time I was a graduate student there were Black students. Well, what was I going to do? So I scoured, and I talked about this yesterday. I scoured like the basement of a progressive bookstore to find plays that were written in the Black arts movement, for example, that again never saw the light of day. So there's fabulous stuff, right, that's there for us, or a genius like Adrian Kennedy, who I think is it's a crime that we don't know about her the way we know about other writers. I mean, there's fantastic roles, but you also have to be willing to work in different forms than realism, because in that time period, people were also experimenting with form.
Absolutely. And not to mention, we have our libraries, which a lot of my students, I'll ask them, do you have a library card? And they're like, what? For what? Who goes there? I said, let me tell you, you'll find plays that no one's doing. You'll find monologues that no one's doing, and they're great. And also you can talk to a librarian who will be very happy to help you find what you're looking for. Trust me. So yes, looking at doing that search is definitely necessary. We definitely talk about creating and writing as the spiritual type of experience, and sometimes we do that with acting too. We talk about theater and acting. It's the spiritual healing experience. And I'm just wondering from the panels, is there a limit on what we should expect from what we're creating? Is there a limit as writers or performers? Any of our panelists would like to take that one?
Well, I see that a little bit with my work with slam. I think there's more than a little out there. I'm not sure how much it exists now, but I know it was super heavy on the scene a few years ago. This language of like writing is therapy, writing is all of that. And I know, especially with young people, I understand how cathartic performing can be and how liberating, and all of those things that I think, the same reasons I try to put those opportunities in front of young people. I understand it's important. It's like no one has to sell me on that. And yet I feel like there was a lot of language out there about like how healing it is to perform your traumas. And so that language to me always made me uncomfortable. It's something I never pushed with kids, because we're in a space where like all of a sudden with these kids, I was seeing kids, slam is scored, 1 to 10, all that kind of stuff. So the kids would like, and they'd notice clear correlations between like the more trauma that they spit, the more, the higher their score might be, and those sorts of things. And and it also led to a narrowing that I saw in the culture that again might still be that I tried to aggressively push against it in Philly, but I saw like a narrowing of the culture to this kind of odd, like trauma centered, like, whereas like if you weren't writing about that, or if you weren't dealing only in anger, or if you weren't like, if you weren't, then you were somehow othered. And I wanted to make sure that, and so in short, like I just wanted to like say, sometimes you're a poet, like it might not heal you. Like you might still need therapy. Like you might still need healthy relationships with other people. You might still need, like, it might be one thing, right? And I feel like, you know, so that's one specific thing that I thought of, that I see in other kinds of performance too. There's like discourse and language about healing that might be in parts true, like might have true elements to it. But sometimes we push that really hard on young people, like really, really hard. And sometimes it might have them not go after the other things that they need. And so I think that's one example.
Yes, I've been witness to that too. Living in New York, and I know that there's one time in particular a poetry slam, and it was like pretty much the same theme, and no one had coordinated a theme at all. So, okay, anybody else want to, Mr. K?
I was saying, I've been in rooms where, like, you know, because kids, especially young people, they'll see someone and they'll see the praise and they'll see all the attention, and so they'll do the same thing. So I've seen rooms where, like, you know, someone goes, trigger warning, self-harm, everyone stands up and leaves because, you know, they don't want to be in the space with that. They come sit down, trigger warning, sexual assault, everyone stands up, they leave. And it becomes this moment where the slams got really ugly for a portion of time, where every single poet, you could see the young kids like making up their minds, oh, this is what this is. This is what this space is. And it became this weird theater in the audience where, like, who's standing up for this? Who's doing this? Well, they stood up for that poem. They're not gonna stand up for this poem. Are they being real? Are they being, like, it became this whole other thing where all of a sudden it became like the badges you wear for being traumatized became a thing. And it became this kind of weird exploit. It felt, as the adult in the room, it felt weirdly exploitive. And I'm like, okay, this cannot be my space. Like, we need to do something else. We need to be in a space where, like, that's an option, but it's not where kids feel like that's the only thing my writing can take me. Because then they might not write anymore. They're like, I don't want to write anymore. If that's what writing is, I don't want to be a poet. I'm happy. Yeah. I don't want to be a poet. Yeah. I guess I can be a poet and be happy at the same time, which is, you know, not what I want kids to be doing.
Very good. Anyone else want to tackle that question about writing as this spiritual experience and sort of the limits of what writing can actually do, or what performing can actually do for a person? Okay, if not, let's move on to, there's a question that our students had about using your voice to promote social justice. And this is something that I know that I encounter a lot, because I tell my students often that I've been in a lot of shows and a lot of plays, but you've never heard of any of them. Because most of them have been in the sort of theater for social justice realm and really tailored to a particular audience. But you all have created these wonderful works that are out there and that are public and that are seen. Is there a compromise that you make while making the art versus really pushing a social justice agenda? Does that make sense? Is there a compromise between here's the artistic vision that I have, and here's the message, if you will, that I really want to promote? It's a hard one. When I was in grad school, we read Jonathan Levinson, and he talked about, you know, how we were taking theater for young audiences in particular and making it educational and making it sort of like stories about morality, and then we had all these other ancillary things like workbooks and all these things, when he talked about the thing in of itself is good enough. So just seeing a play, that experience is good enough.
Well,
Where
you
do
know,
you all land on that?
there's all kinds of plays, and there's all kinds of music. There's hymns, and there's hip hop, and there's parade music. There's the music of the revolution. The people united will never be defeated. And somebody probably remixed that into a dance song. There's so many kinds of music, right? There's orchestral music, and those musics can always mean something else given the circumstances, right? When the Berlin Wall fell and they sang the Ode to Joy, I mean, wow, right? You never know when something will be purposed, or I don't know, what was the music in the street in these most recent protests? When I wrote Twilight, Los Angeles, it was interesting to me, there was no anthem. F the Police was popular, but nobody was really singing that I could find. I went around asking, were there any songs? And ultimately, I asked Jesse Norman, who I've alluded to already today, I said, why do you think there was no songs in the Los Angeles riot when there were songs all throughout the civil rights movement? And she said, oh, yes, we'd sing first and then you'd march and then we'd sing again. But then she concluded, but if I were a young person thinking of the some of the young people, although not everybody in the streets of LA was young, if I were a young person, I felt I was being heard for the first time, it wouldn't be singing as we know it. It would be a roar that would come from the bottom of my feet. I would be just like a lion just roaring. So it wouldn't be singing, it wouldn't be words. It would be like the earth's first utterance, she said. And so, right? So, I mean, to me, a time of discord is actually an extraordinary time for making art. And a time of the unknown is an extraordinary time for making art, because it's an opportunity to be expressive when there are no real words that mean much or that you can trust, right? So, I don't know that I would ever say having any kind of a mission would mean that it wouldn't be art. I'm not an evangelist. I'm a believer. I'm not a Christian evangelist, but there are some Christian evangelist singers that I've tripped over that the music is extraordinary. And then you think, well, why wouldn't it be? If it's a great, big evangelical church with resources, or think of all the Black singers who came out of the church, some didn't. Ella Fitzgerald, who's probably one of the greatest, didn't. But why would I say that church music couldn't be artistic, right? Why would I say that, why would I, and I am attracted to work that is complicated with ideas and feeling. So therefore, I happen to be attracted to work that's political. And also the true political person is a person, or the social justice missionary is a person often with great love, because real revolutionaries were great lovers of humanity. If you go back and you read, in particular, I think Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail, which, as we know, he never spoke, you feel the depth of his love. And artists, too, have an opportunity to be great lovers or very suspicious. So I don't know that we can say one thing or the other, but I guess what I'm saying in a long, sloppy way is that I believe where there's great passion, regardless of what that passion is about or for, you will possibly find an art form.
I love it. Yeah, we talk about those things that sort of like influence us, and the things that propel us to do the work that we do. And I think that this idea of love, that's really the heart of it. That's really getting to the core of it, because without that, you're not motivated to do any of the other work, I don't think, or to create. I'm going to shift gears just a little bit. We had a lot of questions from students about being young and recommendations from the panel about the classroom, that type of thing. So Mr. K, there was a specific question for you about what have you found to be the most productive ways to implement diversity within the classroom? That's a pretty broad question, I know, but handle any part of that you want. How do we get more diversity in the classroom? How do we implement that?
Yeah, it's pretty broad.
So we're talking about, in particular, I think the students are really talking about materials. For example, how do we get a U.S. history class with Black people being portrayed as more than slaves and the civil rights movement? There's a whole lot more than that. So how do we get more of that, and how do we get more Native American voices in history and other classes?
Okay, so if I could pick one thing, and as you said, there's a lot of things. One thing I encourage teachers every time I'm invited out to speak to a school. I say some version of, we have to remember as we're planning, as we're imagining our units, and all of that stuff, we have to remember that lens, not just a subject, and it needs to be respected as such. What I mean by that is, if race is taught as a subject that begins and ends, that naturally others it and puts it into this place where kids can just slide it aside, and it not be the kid's fault, right? Sometimes we'll blame the kids, or how come you're not so inspired by this unit? How come you're not moved? How come you're not? And the kid's like, well, I don't know, it just didn't move me, right? But I think one of the things that helps that is if we remember, instead of thinking it as a subject, think of it as a lens through which we look at all of our learning, or a lens through, same thing with gender and sexuality and all sorts of other things. Stop treating them like subjects with beginnings and ends and start treating them like lenses. A brief example I give, I just finished Lord of the Flies with my 10th graders, right? You cannot think of a whiter book, like white, written by a white guy about a bunch of white boys on an island, right? It is white. And yet, William Golding, the author, has this thesis about how, we're all savage and all that kind of stuff. But the medium he uses to prove that thesis is he has these little white boys turn into caricatures of indigenous people. He has them paint their faces, do dances, go on hunts, all those sorts of things, as if they were indigenous, Native American folks, African folks, blah, blah, blah. He has them take on those caricatures, and he has his characters say lines like, you're acting like a pack of painted Indians, or we're British and the British are best at everything. Once you apply a race lens to Lord of the Flies, it becomes apparent that it is a race book. Like, that's not forcing it, that's not pushing your liberal agenda on it, or indoctrinating the kids, or any of those things that the right wing will accuse folks of. It's literal, it's good teaching, and it's intentional. That's what Golding wrote. That was what he intended. We deracialized it when we removed those conversations from the text. And so what I'm saying is, while every book we teach might not pop like that when you apply a race lens, more of them will than we might think. And the same thing with eras of history, same things with mathematics, same things with music and the arts and stuff like that. Just applying a lens of race, bothering to ask the questions, what are some of the racial dynamics that we may have missed? It's not just going to further kids' racial literacy, it'll make them like the subject more. It's more interesting. Like Lord of the Flies is more interesting with those lenses. Like, my kids were fired up about the other day. Say, yo, bro, that Mr. K, that's racist. Why would he say blah, blah, blah? Kids never snap on Lord of the Flies like that. They never snap on that. But now they're snapping like every day. Can you believe what he... And it's not because I forced anything. It's because I actually bothered to apply the lens. So one of the ways to think about the diversity is the same thing. Like, whatever your subject matter, try to consistently apply the lens of race. just like other lenses, just like you do with gender, just like you do with sexuality. Do it with all of those things, and be comfortable doing that. And don't teach women just when you're doing a women unit. Don't do Black people when you're doing a Black unit. Don't do Indigenous folks or Latinx folks or whatever your group is. Don't think beginning and end, think lens. I think just that, just like faithfully thinking lens over subject, has an amazing, I've seen it completely turn around entire schools. We're just like, every unit we do, we're going to try to apply this lens. Sometimes it's going to pop, and sometimes it's just going to be an interesting little side conversation, but we're always going to apply it.
I love that. And I think that this year we've really been mindful about not having like, all right, we're going to cover the women's plays now, we're going to cover the Black plays now. We're just going to cover plays, right? And every acting lesson that we get, I use Viola Davis as part of our acting technique. And I don't use her as like here's how to be a Black female actor. I use her because she's a great actor, and we can learn a lot from her. So I definitely appreciate what you're saying regarding looking at things through a lens and not a beginning and an end, and everything's all sectioned off. And we get to feel good about ourselves because, hey, we put it in there. We did have a couple of these writers.
The thing about forcing that false beginning and end on it is it makes you make some really unfortunate choices, right? Because if you only have 3 weeks of Black people in your year, you're going to want to check the boxes on slavery and civil rights. Like you're going to want to, because everything becomes about, and so instead of engaging those things in natural ways that flow forth in ways that will naturally intrigue kids, we think that's how we get stuck on oppression instead of in putting folks in their full human experience, right? That's how we end up, instead of like, and I say, when we teach the experience of race, when we talk race, especially this country's history with race, oppression and racism should take up a good portion of it. Like, I'm not saying it shouldn't, I'm not saying we avoid, but I'm saying it becomes the only when we think of it as a subject with just with a hard and fast beginning and end, and this is the Black unit, or this is the Latino unit. Like when it's just that, and we don't bother to apply it year round, to normalize it as something we discuss all of the time because it's worth being discussed all the time, then it narrows it and makes us only focus on those hot button issues that the kids get every February. Like we keep having those same conversations because it's led, and that's due to this segregation of our curriculum when we just look at, these kind of issues as things that beginning it, as subjects and not through a lens.
I totally agree. Any of the other panelists want to speak to that idea of just empowering students in general? We had a lot of, I had a lot of responses from our BIPOC students that expressed that there's a lot of bias in not just in the subject matter, but in casting decisions. They feel that there's bias there. And even sometimes when we're casting a play in a classroom, for example, in my classroom, I allow anybody to play any role. Male, female, doesn't matter. I don't do any casting based on anything other than someone volunteering to do the part. That's not the case in other classes. And there are certain students that feel like they've played the same role over and over, even in a classroom setting. Their question is, how do they empower themselves to have that conversation with a teacher when the power dynamic is so unbalanced with student to teacher? I think, Mr. Kay, in your book, you talk about changing that balance and having a more open classroom and really revolutionizing the way that we think about student-teacher relationships. But any advice on where do they start? Where do they go to when they notice that there's this systemic pattern that's happening and they want to make change? Any advice?
I think something that Mr. Kay said that that really struck me and kind of got me thinking was this idea of kind of an erasure almost of the stories that don't fit into kind of the timeline of the history. Maybe it's of this nation, maybe it's something else. But I think kind of probably a lot of the problems that these students are having has to do with the fact that kind of a lot of time, BIPOC, their stories are kind of condensed into this one thing. And often, for, Native people, like to speak to my own experience, kind of it's like this thing that used to exist in the past, but not understanding that it exists in the contemporary and not being willing to try to understand how that exists in the contemporary, because those identities are so different. And I think a lot of what that comes down to is when we talk about the story of, an Indigenous person, a Black person, kind of that being the story, because there's so few out there. Whereas if you read a story about, a white person, a white man, it's just a story of a white man. It's not the defining story. And I think because of, what we study and what we know of different groups of people and their identities and their backgrounds, it's so much easier to compartmentalize them into that. And I think that also in terms of when we were talking earlier about exploitation, what is healing when we talk about art, I think maybe where healing comes into the equation is when it's a celebration of the people rather than, an exploitation or a commentary. And certainly, like Mr. Kay said, there can be something to that in terms of speaking of trauma, putting it out there. But I think maybe if we're talking about, reclaiming something, it's more about that celebration. And I think something that I've heard a lot is kind of, joy being an act of rebellion and that happiness. And I think there's something within that, within, marginalized groups within the United States and, globally, just kind of realizing that, expressing that joy and realizing that you're so much more than what you have been like kind of put into. And your story it's so much more all encompassing, and that's kind of where I think we can find those connections across groups as well. But in terms of advice, of what I would give is, that's such a hard question because the power dynamics are, so skewed. So I think it does have to do a lot with the instructor and kind of hopefully, I think, this idea of colorblind or like, understanding that, trying to pretend as if we haven't, we're operating on this totally society where race is in a construct or where we're kind of liberated from all of that obviously is not true. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that, because understanding that and having dialogue, nothing is going to change until we have that acknowledgement. So maybe that's the baseline. And then from there we figure out, how we get different stories out there and how you don't have to feel like you're just this one part of it.
Very good. Oh, Ms. Smith, you're muted again.
I'm just wondering, just structurally in institutions, if a place like Orange County School for the Arts is questioning this, and obviously by announcing that question of students, there's somewhere in the leadership this desire to open a space. There's different kinds of talents, and we think about singers, we think about, I don't know, basketball players, beautiful people, but there's also some people have a talent for engagement and others don't. And so in the faculty, there will be people who have more of that inclination, interest, and talent, just like, the music teacher can play the organ. And it makes me think about someone who worked with me, who's now an executive in Hollywood, who was Black and grew up in Detroit. And she told me that she went to a private school, everybody's white. And when she was in third grade, Shauna Waterman is her name. When she was in third grade, she went into the library and she said to the librarian, "How come there's no books about Black people in this library?" And the librarian sat down with her and said, "Help me pick the books." And this was, so she was at Yale when she was working with me in law school. So that was in the 90s. So this was like way back that she was in this in this private school in Detroit. And I thought, wow, that is like amazing that librarian's reaction was, help me pick the books. So there's somebody at your school who's like, help me pick the books. And that person is the person who can invite conversation with the individuals you're calling young, who may be visionary for all we know, in which case, are they really young or are they ahead of us? And so that particular type of individual has a gift. That particular type of, whether it's a teacher or I don't know, maybe it could be anyone in the environment. I was asked to do a workshop at a very fancy school in New York, the Chapin School. People say, why are you doing something at the Chapin School? Well, this head of school was so visionary that when she asked me to come on Saturday and do workshops in her school, she included the janitor and the dean, because she wanted to have a school, a world where everybody cared about what was happening. And so there's a way to think about those visionaries, those young students. You're calling them young, I think of them as visionaries, as being a part of making a more caring environment. And there's somebody in that world who should be in discussion with them.
I agree. I think we are making some inroads. I mean, progress is going slow, and so there are things that are happening sort of like behind the scenes, and there's lots of planning going on. And I think that as we start to release some of the plans that we have, I think that things will be a little bit different, but we're still at those beginning stages of making change. And I know for some of us, I will say just for me, initially, I just said, can't we just start doing things like right now? Very revolutionary. And you realize it, like you said, it's an institution. So when you're working with an institution, it's a little bit different than when I'm working with my own theater group or another outside group that's smaller. But I will say that even this panel, having this discussion today is part of opening things up. We took a lot of the questions that we had today came from our students. So we are starting to get those voices out there. We are starting to figure out more ways of making it happen. And I always tell my students that, if you don't think your teacher's the person that you can talk to, there's got to be someone that you can talk to. Maybe it's the conservatory director, maybe it's your counselor. Certainly it can be your parents, but yeah, it is a tough conversation to go up to a teacher and say, hey, I would love if we could cover more X, Y, or Z. So finding those the adults to go in partnership with, I think is really important. We also have a lot of organizations within our school, like Diversify Our Narrative. That's a new organization that's coming in and that's working with teachers and having some of those discussions. I want to make sure that we get to our,
very quick thing for you. There's a speech of Obama's. I'll find out what it is and look it up and send it to Professor Dorian. And it was early in his presidency, his first time, and it was really about America and about the desire for a more perfect union. And he talked about the importance of dissent as a part of the project.
I remember that a more perfect union speech. I do remember that. Yes, that's a good one for us to go back and review. Well, I want to make sure that we have a few students that wanted to ask their questions directly, and I'm so proud of them. So we're going to take those questions now, and then if there's time left over, I have a few remaining questions that we'll just kind of popcorn around. if there's time at the end. But let's get started with our student questions. And we have Grace Wilcox is the first person that's up.
Hi, my name is Grace Wilcox and I'm a junior. And my question is, how did you realize that sharing your voice with the world would actually make a difference?
Good question. Anyone would like to start? Anybody? Isabella, what made you think that you had all these sort of like internal feelings about things that were happening in your community? What made you say, like, I'm going to be the person that actually speaks publicly about these things?
Yeah, I know. I'm trying to think if there was, such a clear moment, because yes, that's a very huge, I think, responsibility for a person to take on. And I think, for me at least, I think it probably came later in the process. It wasn't necessarily what sparked me to write it in the first place or to even perform it in the first place. But I think it really, something I would point to is we have kind of after every performance a talk back, which is kind of, supposed to be dialogue between, audience and cast. And there's a moderator, but it's pretty informal and it's just kind of a talking kind of to share the experience of what happened and what if anything anybody feels about it and they want to share in that moment. And I think it was probably in one of those moments where you get to hear from the people that you performed with directly, what it was that they witnessed, what it was that they saw, whether it was different than what you thought you were doing. And in some cases it is, and in some cases it isn't. But I'll point to kind of one scene we have in the play. It's a protesting kind of a scene, and there's names of women who have gone missing or have been murdered, and they're kind of spoken together in kind of overlapping one on top of the other. And something that we started doing later on was we had audience members who had names of women that they knew, women in their lives, and they wanted those names included. And, that there's just, I think, something about that, cast members too, this growing list that's so devastating. But I think it also showed the importance of it and how real and present it is in our lives and the audience's lives, especially for those people who have been impacted directly by that. And so I think for me, it kind of removes maybe some of the ego from it. And I think, putting it out there as well, because it was a very humbling experience because it almost goes beyond you, it's for someone else. And I think that's kind of where some of that empowerment can come from as well. So I would say probably that was something that's really stuck with me too. Yeah.
Very good. Thank you, Grace, for your wonderful question. We have another question from Kailani.
Hi, I'm Kailani and I'm a sophomore. And my question was, for those of you with experience in theater and acting, do you think that your experience in acting has helped you to better portray the stories you were trying to convey in your writing?
Well, I'll say that some of my writing is based on performance. So, for example, when I write a first draft of a script and give it to a director, and they want to sit down and start slashing and cutting right away while it's on paper, I say, wait a minute, please, would you let me perform it first? So the first rehearsal is in fact me performing this whole play that's usually 4 hours long, and it's eventually going to be 90 minutes. So, I mean, in my case, part of my technique is all about embodying. I suppose that absolutely, and often I'm teaching now, for example, a film director at NYU, a graduate school of the arts, who, she's acting and it's terrifying for her to have to act. Absolutely terrifying. And I think it's great. I'm like, okay, so now you know how, this is really important for you to feel this way, because maybe on a movie set, won't go over to an actor and say, pick up the pace. Maybe you'll have more to say than that because you understand what we go through. So I think that it's useful for all of us. And for that matter, why not take a class in film music composition for us to understand the entire ecosystem that we're working in. So yeah, it's I would say absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And again, so not just acting, all of it. The more that you can take a class in producing, for gosh sakes. Go learn how to raise money, learn it all, because you don't know what kind of ecosystem you're going to be working in. And the theater is a small, odd, bohemian community more than any of the other art forms, I would say. And so the earliest troops, were these small, they didn't even have directors. I love to say that. It's like actors and a writer and a stage manager. So think of it as an intimate community where it's useful for you to know how to do everything, like being in the Girl Scouts, I suppose.
Yeah. Thank you, Kailani. I think it's so important that we do hear these words being spoken before we start to think about. I mean, that's revolutionary. Whoever thought that, a play should be heard first?
Do you think this should be here? I don't think you should start with that. And let's see.
Yeah.
That doesn't make sense. Okay. Why don't you hear it first?
I love it. And dealing with editors, I can't even imagine. Mr. K, what is it like dealing with an editor?
Well,
and by the way, none of them will ever see this, so go for it.
Oh no, I have.
Are you kidding me? He's got it on recording, and we live in the world of social media.
I have the greatest respect for my editor. It was for me. She was more of a coach, to be honest. It was kind of like, hey, come on. You think you can give me another? I'm like, because I had a actually pretty eventful, like personal, that was a window of my life that also I was going through a lot. So it was kind of like bringing it home. I just needed a voice to like help me bring it home. And so I think in that, it's great. And one thing also that she was great at that I would just advise students who are listening here is, being selectively stubborn with what you want. Like I knew like teachers are a tough audience, right? And I know what professional development books normally read like. And I said, I don't care if I don't care about, I don't want that. Like at the very least, I want it to be a good read. Like that was my thing. I want it to be a good read. And so I predetermined to say, I'm going to listen to all advice, but at the same time, I am going to tell stories like I'm writing a piece of fiction. I'm going to tell story, like I'm going to lean into the story thing because I am a teacher, been teaching for 15 years. I know what we want to hear and I know what we don't want to hear. And I had to trust my gut and say, no one who isn't in the classroom is going to tell me what I need to hear, or the style that's going to work most for me. I know it, I trust it. If I'm wrong, but I'm not going to put anything out there that's dry. And so one of the things that means, where that means the most to me is when teachers from around the country say, I think it's a good read. Like it was like a novel. I want to know what was happening. Like that's not how we normally speak about professional development books. And so that was my biggest goal, is to just produce a good read. How that it applies to students is I think sometimes, and I've been guilty of this as an English teacher, we teach analytical writing and creative writing sometimes as if like never the twain shall meet. Like these are two different things, like two different styles, two different sets of tools, two different things. When you're making an argument, thesis, context, quote analysis, like it's formulaic. Creative, just follow your heart and do it. We act as if they don't inform each other at all. And I think one of the biggest things is like, I'm going to write this. A book is essentially a really long analytical essay. Like it's essentially, that's what it is. Like I have my thesis, I'm trying to prove it, but I'm going to infuse it with life and storytelling and funny. I'm going to tell jokes. They might not be funny. I don't know, but I'm going to lean into it. Like I'm going to, and so what I would tell kids is like, when you're working in your, you know, when you're doing, don't buy, sorry, teachers, don't buy the idea that this essay, that there's a, that the dryness is absolute. Like, and don't buy that the formula is absolute. In fact, the great essays, the great speeches, you know, the more perfect unions, all of those like have elegant style. Like there's style in it and there's voice in it. And that comes from just like, you know, and that's something I've had to work on again, because I know my students will say, well, hey, that's not how you taught me. It's a recent development in my life to say, you know, I've always had kids write creatively, but those were distinct projects, right? There was the analytical project, right, the creative project, but now I'm starting to find fusions because I'm realizing how important that is. And that came because I wrote a book, because I had, like, before writing a book, that didn't register in my head how important, like, I want to write the analytical essay that actually people are excited to read. Like I want to write.
Can I just say personally, reading your book, we're the teachers here at OCSA, we're all reading your book, by the way. And we're going to do a professional development with you, I think next semester. I don't want to be quoted on that, but I think that's coming down the line. But let me tell you something. We get books all the time that we're reading for professional development, right? We do. Every year there's at least 2 or 3 books that are recommended or that are going to be discussed. And we have all been so grateful for your book, because it is not dry. It does read like a novel or a story. And we're taking it sort of like chapter by chapter and breaking into small groups. But this is what's been happening. We all have read ahead. Like no one can contain themselves to read that one chapter. And then we start having this discussion. They're like, oh yeah, that's not in this chapter yet. So that's a testament to how well that your book is written. It really is. We can't help ourselves. So thank you for going in that style versus a strictly academic style is what I tell my students. It's like when sometimes I read something and it's full of stats and it's full of all that good stuff that it should be full of, I say to them, it's very academic, which means let's get creative. So thank you so much.
I find like the things, it's because of spoken word and performing and like all of those things I try to push the kids into. It's like, I used to try to be cute with the kids where like, you're doing these poems, so one day you'll write like amazing vows and one day you'll do, but it's kind of reshaping it to, no, we're working as performance poets so that you can really land that business deal. We're working on performance poets so that you can get that, so that your cover letter pops. Like, and I'm starting to break down these walls of like, you know, that style is not just in one space. That style is writing. Like it should be everywhere.
It's kind of like with performing when we talk about improv, and that improv is for actors and people from all walks of life and all professions. We have a couple more questions from students. We have Haley has a question. She's a 7th grader here, and I'm excited to hear from her. Haley, what's your question? Eric, for some reason, we can't hear Haley. Doesn't look like she's muted.
She's not. I think it's on her end.
Haley, do you mind if I just go, if I ask the question for you? Is that okay? All right. So Haley's question was, when you started doing what you do, what gave you the courage to do it? This is from our 7th grader, Haley. So anyone want to talk about the courage to write? Miss Smith?
Well, I just want to quickly say that Senator Cory Booker said to me recently that Black people have to resurrect hope every single day. You know, that's the question, especially about art, you know, where's the hope? Especially if you tell sad stories like me. Where's the hope? And I love this idea that Black people have to resurrect hope every day. Let me tell you, I have to resurrect courage every day. And it's not like what gave me, it wasn't given to me ever. And every single time that I do a new project, I've got to go and resurrect courage. I teach on Sundays for 4 hours. I've been teaching since 1974, and I don't do much on the day before I teach. And I sit in front of my computer now that we're on Zoom for a half hour quietly before I, you know, they're already there, before I hit, you know, the thing to come in the room. So I don't think courage is a given. We're all made differently. Some people are confident. I'm not. And in fact, I start every class that I teach saying, confidence is overrated. Give doubt a try. I live in doubt. And I don't have courage.
One thing I would add is something that I tell my performers is, you know, take little risks and then take some not as little risks. And then, like, I'll tell kids, I tell them, be honest, it's like, yo, that first time up on stage, you look up, you see 300 people, you're gonna shake and your palms are gonna sweat and all that. We tell them all these things before it happens, and then I make jokes like, you might pee yourself, but only a little. Like, we have all this kind of, and then it says, but you'll survive. It won't kill you, and then you'll be super proud of yourself. And it's one of those moments where the kids will come off the stage and they'll be like 13 years old. I have middle school kids who says, I did it, I survived. And once they realize that it won't kill them, they do something a little bit harder, right? And so put yourself, Haley, in positions to take a little risk. Like, learn that it doesn't kill you, and then take a slightly larger risk, and then learn that it still did not kill you. You'll be surprised how quickly you develop to say, you say, well, the worst thing that happened is I forgot the last stanza. Did not kill me. They all just kind of looked at me. It was awkward. The DJ played and I got off the stage. Pulse is still going though. It didn't kill me. Like, you learn that the worst things that you can imagine, they happen, and they're like, yeah, that's actually not that bad. Okay, I'll try it again. So that's the one thing I would add, Haley, is just like, put yourself in a position to take a little risk and realize it doesn't kill you. And then keep going.
I love that response. Okay, we don't want to run out of time, so I want us to have our last question directly from students. That's going to be from Gretty. Gretty, are you here today? Let's see. Okay, I don't see her. So we're gonna do a little round of quick questions to end our discussion today. So these are really quick questions. Ms. Smith, you were nominated for a Tony and a Pulitzer. Can you tell us anything about the nominating process?
Well, anybody can be nominated for a Pulitzer. Anybody. In my case, it's actually, I was a runner-up for the Pulitzer Prize for Fires in the Mirror. But the nomination process is that a theater can nominate your play if it was done in a specific period of time. So the nomination in that case is not a big deal. For the Tony, it's, you know, complicated. I was a Tony nominee, a voter this year. Of course, I don't even know why they're having the awards because the year was short. But yeah, there are two different types of processes, but anybody can get nominated for a Pulitzer Prize.
See, I bet we didn't know that until today, so thank you. Mr. Kay, other than your book, do you have any other books or writings that you would recommend for students?
I'm sorry, I lost volume for a second. Can you say that again?
Oh, other than your book, do you have anything that you would recommend that students read at this time?
Oh,
or it could be movies, or it could be anything songs, artists, anything that, any recommendations for young people?
My students, my students cannot get enough. I just finished teaching Far From the Tree. My kids adore it. Like my student teacher brought it to me last year, and my ninth graders just ate it up. Just like exploration of family and like different kinds of family, what makes a family. So, if you're, I definitely, if anyone's, ninth, 10th grade, like they ate it up. And so I would start there, I guess.
Okay, very good. Isabella, any movies or stories that you've recently seen that you would recommend for our students?
Yeah, something that just kind of popped into my head when Mr. K was talking about poetry is I've never really, written a lot of poetry or read a lot of poetry. It's something I started doing recently because, there's something so cool about it. But recently I read There, which is, it's kind of a collection of works by a Native author, Layli Long Soldier, and it was just kind of a really cool experience where I listened to a podcast she gave too about it, which was very illuminating because the way that it was structured, it's not something you can totally understand without a little bit of guidance all the time. So, I think that was just kind of to what was said earlier about, why limit yourself. And I think, across all art realms, I obviously did acting in the OCSA Acting Conservatory, but then, writing is something that's super cool, and even poetry. And there's so many connections, I think, within all of that, and with all that collecting too that we talked about. So I would recommend that just right now. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff out there. You just got to find it.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you, panelists. It's been an incredible experience having all three of you here today. I think all of our students, we have so many golden nuggets, I think, that we can mine from this conversation. We're going to close out today. If all of our panelists, one by one, if I can have you say your goodbyes. I'm going to say a couple of words at the very end, but Isabella, let's go Isabella, Mr. K, and Miss Smith.
Yeah, so it's been an honor to be here. I feel like I've learned just so much just from hearing and talking and saying things that I didn't even realize, I was thinking about, that was in the back of my head. So yeah, thank you for inviting me. I'm just super excited, I think, by, what I hear, what I see, and just kind of, those people who have things to say and who want to say it. And I think that's super exciting. To see that as well, and to hear these types of stories. So I just kind of end on kind of an excited and hopeful note too. Yeah.
Yeah, just, building on that. Thank you so much for having me. The one thing I'd say to all of y'all, in addition, just to add on, is hold us accountable, hold the grown folks accountable. I thought I've been thinking about this question that was asked earlier about things that happen in the classroom. And I'm thinking, like, ask us to do surveys. We can be systemic about getting your feedback. We don't have to, it doesn't have to be like, make us have systems that hold us accountable. That's what I would say. Just like expect high things from us as grown folks. And then if we fall short of your mark, tell us. But thanks so much for having us.
Ms. Smith?
Well, I just say thank you for having me here. And this is my second time coming to your wonderful school. And it sounds to me like you're in some transitional moment, at least in this area of equity and race. And I guess that word inclusion, but also it seems to me, as I said yesterday, that there must be the seeds, to go back to Haley's question, for courage, particularly when I think back on the wonderful works that I saw yesterday that I was shocked had not been rehearsed. for people to come to a stranger, me, they'd never seen before, known before, and to bring out raw work. So it says to me there's something in the water at the Orange County School for the Arts, which fosters courage and therefore fosters change. And of all places, behind the orange curtain, oh my goodness. that gives me hope right there.
We are the oasis behind the orange curtain. Yes, we are. Indeed. Well, thank you again. And I wanted to leave today with a quote. But before I do, I want to remind our BSU students from SGV and from OSHA that we are going to have a meet and greet at 4 o'clock. So hang on. Thank you, everybody, for attending. And I really want to encourage us to be creators. You know, some of us say we are performers or we are actors, but I think it's important that we all become devisers. I want to leave with a quote, and this quote is from Twilight Bay. Here's the quote. You are the living, breathing representation of every ancestor that you ever had. And when you speak with the voices of millions, not just one. I think there's no better way to close out than that quote.